Welcome to Prescribed by Dr. Nathan Goodyear, where integrative oncology meets holistic healing. This podcast is your home for the latest in innovation, exploration, and elevation in all areas of integrative oncology, medicine, health, wellness, and beyond. Join me and a host of other innovators as we go from practicing to prescribing. Your daily dose of wellness begins now.
Early onset cancers. You know, when we talk about cancer, the narrative has been that we're winning the war on cancer. First of all, is it really a war? Or should we be focusing on empowering the immune system to do what it's targeted and created to do? There was a recent British Medical Journal article talking about early onset cancers, and Dr. Williams and I talked about it on our Goodwill show, which we're live streaming every Friday at 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, where we basically review the week of really prominent stories, research, etc., in the arena of integrative medicine, oncology, and even regenerative medicine or anti-aging, because these are all tied together. But what was really interesting about this is they were baffled by looking at these early onset cancers, and they identified 11 of them. Now, what's interesting is there's some crossover, and I'll touch on that in just a second, but you know, everybody's looking for the magic bullet as it relates to cancer causation as well as cancer treatment, and that's just not going to exist. That's not going to exist in the traditional, quote unquote, conventional form of medicine. It's not going to exist in natural, holistic, integrative medicine, even repurposed medications. That just does not exist. That's a failed theory with Paul Ehrlich back in the 19th century. But we have to understand cancer is a series of multi-system failures. Now we're seeing these accelerated failures, and that's why we're seeing earlier and earlier cancers that are more aggressive. But here, looking at the metabolomics, the microbiomics, and the immunomodulomics, so the metabolism, looking at the microbiome, and looking at the immune system, this is a very interesting axis that can explain a lot of what we're dealing with these early onset cancers in initiation as well as progression. What's interesting is it's not the first time we're seeing these numbers like this. The CDC came out a couple of years ago looking at obesity-associated cancers, and they identified 13. When you look at those 13, and when you look at the 11 with the British Medical Journal, what you found a lot of overlap. But in the obesity-associated cancers, what they also noticed, these were increasing, whereas other cancers were decreasing. Just like with the British Medical Journal, they're seeing earlier onset, whereas others are not really changing. So we're seeing a changing demographics of cancer. But in these obesity-associated cancers, which I'll identify in just a second, what they noticed is that there was an age-adjusted mortality rate that was increasing in these types of cancer. So these individuals that were obese, these obesity-associated cancers, their mortality rate was increasing, pointing to a different behavior of cancer, more aggressive type of behavior of cancer. Maybe it's the compounding of the metabolism in conjunction with the immune dysfunction, which we'll touch on in just a second. But you know, what's interesting here is this tripling, it was a tripling of age-adjusted mortality rates in the adults here in the obesity-associated cancers from 1999 to 2020. So 21 years, that's one generation. From 3.73 per million to 13.52 per million. That is an increase of 3.6. That's incredible in that length of time. So these are two parallel trends. And if we ignore them at our own peril. Where we may ignore them is because there's a lack of curiosity. See, there's the lack of the ability to question the narrative, a lack of the curiosity of the current dogma. As cancer is changing, younger and younger patients getting more aggressive cancer, and obesity-associated cancer changing the demographics. We have an obligation to challenge the narrative, the dogma, follow the science, but we cannot ignore these parallel trends. We just can't do it because they have shared etiologies. They have a common thread. And so when we look at these 11 cancers in young adults, they looked at them in age 20 to 49. It was colorectal, breast, ovarian, endometrial, pancreatic, liver, kidney, gallbladder, thyroid, multiple myeloma, oral cancer was not included. That was one of the 11. Everything minus the oral was parallel to the 10 and the 13 obesity-associated cancers. So the oral was not early onset, but it was more likely alcohol, smoking, HPV induced, but there was not a younger and younger adults. But in those other 10, looking at the 13 obesity-associated cancers, they mapped. So there was 10 within the 11 of the early onset cancers, and there was 10 within the 13 of the 13 obesity-associated cancers. The remaining 3 of the obesity-associated cancers that were not shown to be connected here was esophageal adenocarcinoma, so esophageal cancer, gastric cancer, and then meningioma. But what you see here is that 91% of these early onset cancers are obesity associated. Again, direct overlap of 10 of them. Significant parallels here. Now, why is this important? Well, 74% of US adults, according to CDC, are overweight or obese. And this is a number that continues to go up. Now, RFK is working to, I think, reduce that trend. And of course, there's a lot of opposition to it, which is really interesting that there's opposition to making people healthy. What's that got to do with it? Anything other than the corruption of politics. But the question is, are we going to see a change in this trend on its own? Well, Fox News recently highlighted a growing obesity trend in adolescents aged 2 to 19, where it had increased from 19% to 21.2%. And what's alarming about that is that it's increasing. So that means the generation coming behind the adults is increasing in obesity. 70% of those children that are obese, they will carry that beyond the age of 30. So that means most cases they're going to carry it throughout their life. And so we would expect to see the overweight and obese rates and percentages to only increase. So when we look at obesity, there's been this debate about, is obesity a disease? I think it definitely contributes to disease. There's no question about that. But I think it's really kind of a marker. It's, I wouldn't say it's a root cause initially, maybe now it's becoming a root cause because it's so prevalent, but obesity as a marker, it's becoming a major contributor. See, there's accesses here involved in what I believe is driving the early onset of cancer. There's a metabolic axis, right? Obviously. And this is, when you look at obesity, you see the hyperinsulinemia, you see the IGF-1, you see the increase in leptin, which is pro-tumorigenic, pro-inflammatory, decrease adiponectin, which is decreasing tumorigenic and decreasing inflammatory. And all of this is leading to toxicity to the DNA. It's leading to impaired repair of DNA damage as a result of this, toxicity to the genomics, lipotoxicity, and it leads to mitochondrial dysfunction. Now, there's also another axis, an inflammatory axis, and microbial axis, and immune axis. So now the question is, are these all part of the same process but in different areas, or are these just multiple system failures? When you look at the inflammatory axis, these are things like interleukin-6, tumor necrosis factor alpha, JAK-STAT3 activation, all of these promoting chronic inflammation, which accelerates aging and inflammaging. This promotes senescence and also senescence-associated secretory phenotypes, promoting systemic inflammation. Microbial axis, I think this is one that is very intimate. And the question is, again, the different manifestations, different compartments, but same underlying processes. And I think that's what we're seeing. We're seeing products of the environment affecting the metabolism, products of the environment affecting the inflammatory or immune system, products of the environment affecting the microbial system. But also when you affect the microbial system, that in turn affects the metabolomics, the inflammation. So they're not isolated, but they're all intertwined. And if you affect the immune system, you're also going to affect the microbial system. You're going to affect the immune system, you affect the metabolism. So it all goes together. But in the microbial axis, what we're seeing now is an alteration of the actual, from a eubiotic to a dysbiotic state, decrease in diversity, increase in pathobions. And this is creating altered gut metabolome, and this is affecting systemic immune function. We'll talk more about that in a second. And all of this leads to immune alteration. So understand inflammatory axis and immune axis are, though connected, they're quite different. See, in the immune axis here, we're talking primarily about the tumor immune microenvironment with the tumor microenvironment. Are we seeing an environment that is favoring more of immune-excluded, immune desert, keeping the immune system out of the equation, protecting the tumor against the immune system? Are we seeing more of that today than we ever have? Now, hard to really say that because we're just discovering of these tumor immune microenvironments, what's called inflamed, immune-excluded, and immune desert. But we know there's a pattern of immune cells recruited to the tumor microenvironment that are immunosuppressive, like myeloid-derived suppressing cells, T-regulating cells, and these are going to blunt or downregulate the activity and infiltration of CD8 cytotoxic T cells and natural killer cells, all this favoring a pro-tumorigenic versus an anti-tumorigenic environment. So let's break down each one of these just a little bit in short term. So the metabolic axis, of course, we've got the hyperinsulinemia, which we all recognize plays as a major role. Everybody wants to focus on glucose causing cancer, glucose contributing to cancer. And there's some truth to that because, cancer loves the glycolytic pathway, but there's many cancer types that use many other pathways. But insulin is a powerful growth factor, IGF-1, powerful growth factor, and this is promoting cellular proliferation and inhibiting apoptosis. And so what this is creating is a permissive environment for something like cancer to actually initiate, develop, and survive. Again, promote growth, but actually downregulate the ability to stimulate programmed cell death of abnormal cells that are promoting growth. So here, insulin and IGF-1 are really promoting this issue. The leptin-adiponectin balance issue, we always want to focus on insulin, glucose, insulin, IGF-1, but adiponectin and leptin are very important. Leptin is very pro-inflammatory, and it's product produced with obesity, again, showing a connection there. And it's very pro-proliferative. In contrast, when we look at adiponectin, which is typically downregulated in obesity, and you typically see that downregulated in cancer as well, it's anti-inflammatory and anti-tumorigenic. So what we have here in this adiponectin, these are hormones produced by fat, obese cells, adipocytes. The adiponectin imbalance as a product of this metabolomic change is actually also promoting tumor cell survival and angiogenesis, the blood vessel supply growth that cancer so desperately needs. So we have to rethink how we envision metabolism, not just affecting glucose balance and insulin levels, but how it's targeting these quote unquote hallmarks of cancer that are propping up these cells to not just survive, but actually thrive and resist against the body's mechanisms to destroy it. Then we look at lipotoxicity and mitochondrial dysfunction. I think a lot of people, again, want to look at disease like cancer through the prism of, magic bullet. And they'll say that mitochondria are, as I have a cup of coffee here, mitochondria are the cause of cancer. Now, mitochondrial dysfunction definitely is contributed here. So when we look at the stressor of this process of chronic inflammation, it does impair mitochondrial function. We do see an overwhelming production of oxidative stress, reactive oxygenation species, and this leads to accelerated DNA damage, genotoxicity, and these accumulate because the ability to repair that damage, it becomes compromised. Thus, we get unstable DNA, and this leads to mutations and malignant transformation. So all of this is connected and a product of the metabolic axis here in what we're talking about with these early onset cancers. One of the things about the lipotoxicity, it actually impairs the metabolic fitness of T cells. So here we're not just talking about the generation of the hallmarks of cancer, but we're also talking about the ability of T cells to metabolically meet the demand of something like cancer. But of course, that would also apply to something like infection. Now, the microbiome axis, the microbiome axis. Here what we have is a very interesting, I think this is, there's probably some that are primary, some that are secondary, some that are tertiary. And I would say the microbial axis is one that is, I think, one of the primary drivers of the early onset cancers that we're seeing. See, we're seeing a shift in the microbiome. I've talked about the microbiome research repeatedly because it's pointing to an extinction event. We talk about extinction events within the animal kingdom, yet within the gut microbiome of our children, the Microbiome research update last year at 2 years published showed that 25% of these children that are being followed, that were recruited at 3 to 7 months, they're being followed out for 7 years, they're showing an extinction event of Bifidobacterium taxa, which means that whole group of bacteria just gone. What's the implications there? Well, I'll tell you, it's immune impact. Now, so we're seeing a loss of healthy, what's called commensal bacteria, and this is reducing the diversity of the bacteria. Now, when you lose that normal eubiotic state, you get dysbiosis, and this is where unhealthy bacteria that are opportunistic, that are outright pathogenic, they start to percolate, start to grow. So you get this dysbiotic state, which promotes chronic inflammation, but that then disrupts the metabolome. See, everybody wants to focus on the gut microbiome bacteria, but there's many other aspects of the microbiome. There's virome, there's archaea, there's the metabolome, which these are metabolomics. These are the metabolites that are a result of the bacteria that are there or not there. And so you're gonna have a different metabolome in a eubiotic state versus a dysbiotic state. I think even today, it's hard to even know what is a normal healthy gut microbiome. What's a normal healthy eubiome state of an adult? I don't really know if we know that anymore. But so when you get this change in the gut metabolome, you're going to get a breakdown of metabolites that are different. So for example, when looking at small chain fatty acids, butyrate, propionate, acetate, you're going to see those reduce in a dysbiotic state. You're going to see alteration in the bile metabolism, the acids there, the bile acids in the metabolism. And all of this is going to lead to an altered gut epithelial layer. This gut epithelial layer is going to break down integrins, and this is where that leaky gut, quote unquote, comes from. And because of the increase of pathobionts or pathogenic bacteria, opportunistic, so for example, like gram-negative bacteria that produce an endotoxin like lipopolysaccharide, it'll sneak through those breaks in the dam, if you will, into the systemic circulation, bind to toll-like receptor type 4, and stimulate chronic immune inflammation. Chronic immune inflammation. That's inflammation driven by the immune system. See, when we talk about inflammation, everybody says, well, that's bad. And here I'm kind of talking about that because it's chronic and it doesn't go away. But not all inflammation is by itself bad. So you go out and you step outside and you sprain an ankle, guess what? That swells. That's a key marker of inflammation. That there is not bad, it's actually good. So we have to put it all in context. At the same time, just saying stimulating the immune system is not always good. If we're stimulating immune cells that are immunosuppressive, we are in turn actually promoting an environment that favors a pro-tumor immune environment. And so the things that actually drive this gut breakdown is really interesting, and a topic for another day, because we're talking about what I've called the antibiotics, ultra-processed foods, dietary fiber deficiency, obesity, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse as it relates to the metabolomics. And here this leads to systemic immune suppression, inflammation, and cellular senescence. Now, what's interesting about this process is we can really break it down to microbial dysbiosis, gut barrier failure, immune modulation, and systemic inflammation. See, this process, though it's a sequential process, and we like to think of it that way, it's kind of all happening at once. But here's what the research is showing, how this cascading dysfunction is leading to this process that then favors the environment that allows cancer to develop. In the microbial dysbiosis, you have reduced diversity. And that dysbiotic state allows, again, the growth of those pathobionts and the pathogenic bacteria. This alters the gut metabolism, decreasing the small chain fatty acids, as I mentioned, like butyrate, propionate, acetate, and also, again, the altered bile acid signaling. Now, this then leads to that second phase, of which are subcomponents, the gut barrier breakdown. Here we have the breakdown of gut epithelium, the integrins. We have the leaky gut, that's a lipopolysaccharide from the gram-negative bacteria, actually binding to toll-like receptors. Here, actually driving systemic inflammation through immune dysregulation, but it's because of that leaky gut. Then immune modulation is the third category there, and that lipopolysaccharide is binding to the toll-like 4 receptor, and that's stimulating that chronic inflammation, which I just said. But what's interesting is that inflammation actually disrupts other metabolic pathways. So it leads to what's called disordered tryptophan metabolism, where tryptophan normally gets converted to serotonin, but here in the presence of the chronic inflammation driven by this process we just described, you're seeing actually tryptophan being converted to kynurenine. This is via the upregulation because of the chronic inflammation of endolamine 2,3-dioxygenase. And this process is intimately involved in immunosuppression as it relates to cancer. But then we have systemic inflammation. This is the fourth. And what we see here is we see chronic systemic inflammation ongoing. Again, inflammation is not itself bad, but when it doesn't turn off, it's chronic, it's systemic, then that's where something that's good becomes something that's bad. This promotes accelerated aging, what's actually been described in the literature as inflammation-induced aging or inflammaging. This increases cell senescence. See, when these cells are aging at an accelerated rate, behaving abnormally, not repairing DNA breaks that are there, becoming very dysfunctional, the body has mechanisms to actually stop them from replicating. That's called cell senescence. But the problem is when they stop replicating, they don't die. They remain metabolically active, producing growth factors and inflammatory markers. And so this increases further chronic inflammation and accelerates further cell aging. So you can see with this systemic inflammatory pathway, we're getting a cycling of the process. And this then starts to alter the behavior of the environment and the behavior of the cells. And that's why I believe one of the access points of why we're seeing this process of earlier onset cancers that are more aggressive. It's just not they're early. It's just not that we have better screening techniques. It's that they're earlier and they're more aggressive. And again, when you look at the obesity-associated mortality rates associated with that, some of the obesity-related cancers and the age-adjusted mortality rates, what we have is we're seeing actually higher mortality, which supports that. And again, there's crossovers of 10 cancers there between the two. And again, this immune axis looking particularly, not just systemically, but within the confines of the tumor microenvironment. Spatial omics are telling us very important that the immune cells that are present within the tumor microenvironment, their relationship to each other, their proximity in the spatial omics is telling us whether the immune system is going to be activated, the immune system is not going to be activated. So we have this immune suppression that I talked about with the coming from the gut, that is the disordered tryptophan metabolism. And this process leads to upregulation of T-regulating cells, myeloid-derived suppressing cells, creating an immunosuppressive environment within the tumor microenvironment, keeping the immune system out. We have chronic low-grade inflammation that creates a pro-tumor environment. Again, things like the breakdown of the leaky gut, lipopolysaccharide because of the dysbiotic state, activating toll-like 4 receptor, leading to nuclear factor kappa beta activation, leading to chronic inflammation. This creates that chronic bed of inflammation that cancer loves to lie in. All of this is accelerating the cell aging. This promotes cell senescence, which they stop regulating, but they further create the balance of pro-inflammatory process that is going to further disrupt other pathways and other signaling that will further create an environment that allows cancer to actually survive and thrive. And the way it can survive and thrive is to keep the immune system out. So here, this immune axis is promoting cold tumor immune environments. Cold meaning the immune system may or may not see the tumor, but it's kept from doing anything about it. This would classify in what we call the immune-excluded immune desert, which immune desert is the immune system is not even primed to see the tumor. It doesn't even know it's there. And then immune-excluded means the immune system sees it, is recruited to the immune environment there, but it's kept out of the parenchyma of the tumor, and so it can't do anything about activating the immune system against the tumor. There's no antigen presentation, there's no activation of the immune system, there's no activation of immune memory against the tumor. And so as a result of this compromised or altered tumor immune microenvironment, which I think is going right back to the processes here that we've just described and driving this process of early onset cancers, is we see an increased immunosuppressive cell population of immune cells, the myeloid-derived suppressing cells, the T-regulating cells, the tumor-associated macrophages, because in this environment of cancer that's hypoxia, this shifts the polarization of these macrophages from an anti-tumor, which is M1 type, to pro-tumor, which is M2. And these immune cells, now they are immune cells recruited to the tumor microenvironment, the tumor, particularly immune microenvironment. They are favoring immunosuppression. Keep the immune system out. Isn't it fascinating here that the tumor is in a way recruiting immune cells, and then the immune cells are in turn creating the environment that keeps the immune system out? It's like, it's almost autoimmune-esque. So then what happens is we have compromised CD8 cytotoxic T cell activity. We have compromised natural killer cell activity. That's without anything else. That's just simply looking at just this finite immune axis here. We're not talking about stress and loneliness suppressing natural killer cells. We're not talking about poor sleep suppressing the immune system. We're not talking about anything else. We're simply talking about an imbalance here created by this immune axis, created by this metabolomic axis, created by the microbiome axis, all of it driving what I believe is the mechanisms that are leading to these early onset cancers. And I believe the net result here is why we're seeing more immune desert, immune excluded. We're seeing more tumors that just don't respond to the immune system at their outset. Now, when we look at these classifications of tumors, we have to understand that you can't classify the tumor immune microenvironment types, the phenotypes, the environments, simply across all tumor types. And this is important to understand because we must understand the type of cancer, what we must do to activate and engage the immune system. It's a very different form of thinking of rather than just destroy the tumor, okay? Because if you destroy the tumor, you destroy the immune system, you destroy healthy cells, and this creates major problems down the road. And this in many ways is why tumors can recur and metastasize. And when tumors metastasize, then that's the cause of 90% of morbidity and mortality associated with cancer. So when we look at category 1, where this is predominantly immune desert, these are tumor types such as pancreatic, liver, ovarian, colorectal, early onset, more aggressive, predominantly immune desert. The immune system is not even primed. I think this goes back to even pre-birth, pre-pregnancy. Maternal obesity has been shown to actually suppress CD4 T cells. This can actually be passed on to the children. Then the individual loses the weight, yet the metabolic function improves, yet the immune dysfunction remains. Did you get that? Obesity suppresses T cell activation, CD4 T cells here, and as a result of that, that can be passed on to the child, leaving their immune system compromised, suppressed. But then what happens is when the obesity, the metabolism is reversed, the weight is lost, that immune dysfunction, that memory of that remains, despite the metabolic issues being solved. So these here are predominantly immune desert, immune excluded. Are we seeing this inherited? Are we seeing mothers cast this immune excluded preference that we see now in early onset pancreatic, early onset ovarian, early onset colorectal? I think it's a player. I definitely think it's a major player. Intermediate convertible mean immune desert, immune excluded, breast and endometrial kidney. So again, you're going to approach these different category types differently because of whether the immune system is primed or whether the immune system is simply excluded. And we'll talk a second about that. And then immunogenic but suppressed, these are like thyroid, multiple myeloma. These are inflamed. This is where the immune system does get into the tumor immune microenvironment, does get into the parenchyma. It's not kept peritumoral or out in the dense extracellular matrix, and so it's kept out of the action and it can't engage. But here within the parenchyma, it's actually restrained, it's suppressed, it's dysfunctional, again, because of the tumor. So the drivers of the early onset increase. And I've kind of touched broadly on these axes, metabolomics, the microbiomics, the immunomodulomics, and even the inflammatory, which includes the immune axis as well. But we have to look at the neonatal programming. See, when we talk about cancer and this shifting demographics, what we're really seeing is a process of programming. We're actually programming the disease. We're sowing the seeds that are developing this legacy of disease that is now manifesting at earlier ages and more aggressive. I mentioned the epigenetic reprogramming event that alters immune function, that's through DNA methylation, particularly suppressing the CD8 T cell lymphocytes in mothers that are obese. But again, maybe the impact of that is lost on those listening. It creates a durable immune memory that can be passed from mother to child. That is intergenerational inheritance. So the mother's mere overweight or obese can lead to immune suppression that can be passed to the child right there. Now the question is, does that then go on to future generations, what would be called transgenerational? But here it's driving chronic inflammatory signaling. it is seeding the process of immune dysfunction, here immune suppression, right out of the gate. And this persists, again, despite the weight loss and the metabolic reversion. So the body fails to forget the immune dysfunction, though it forgets the metabolic dysfunction and the excess weight. And again, it can be transferred from mother to child. That's called intergenerational. So that right out of the gate, irregardless of type of birth, breastfeeding, antibiotics, etc., obesity is driving immune suppression, immune dysfunction. And of course, the other early life programming would be things such as birth mode. Is it C-section versus vaginal birth? Is it breastfeeding or formula fed? Are we dealing with chronic antibiotic exposure, repeated antibiotic exposure, especially early in development? All of these are seeding events, but collectively they are a process of seeding events that affect each other. So we can't say one seeding event is more important than the other. I think what we're seeing is a cascade of events that are really feeding on themselves to create a mass sowing of seeds, if you will, that are propagating this early onset cancer that we're seeing. And then you add in other things like ultra processed foods, etc. And then the childhood obesity, and then the xenobiotics, the organophosphate, organochlorides, heavy metals. All of these are just compounding the issue. Glyphosate, they're just compounding the issue. It's that we have a dysfunctional soil that we've sown because we've thrown and sowed the seeds of dysfunction, and then we piled it on top. And this is why I think we're seeing these age-adjusted mortality rates triple in certain types of cancer that mirror these early onsets. And this is promoting accelerated aging at the micro level. It's not like we're seeing accelerated aging at the macro, we're seeing it at the micro level. Here we're talking about the cell level. And so the body has capacity to handle that, and that's cell senescence. Basically, accelerated cell aging stop them because they're dysfunctional, but they don't stop promoting growth, don't stop promoting inflammation. They simply stop replicating. Again, that's called the senescent-associated secretory phenotype. It's stopping the replication, the growth, but it's perpetuating the chronic inflammatory state that then further leads to further accelerated aging. And it's this chronic inflammatory cycle, immune dysfunction, that I believe is accelerating these more immune-excluded, immune desert environments within the tumor microenvironment that's creating immune dysfunction. And again, these age-adjusted mortality rates, one generation tripling. One generation. You see these memes on social media where people on the beach, 50s and 60s, and nobody's overweight, nobody's obese. And you see this in the movies too. Now, granted, movies, they create a picture, but you see these in real life in historical photos. And that now you look at the beach and you're like, wow, it's the people that are normal weight that are the rarity. And I believe these are the pathways. These are the canary in the coal mines. These are the physical manifestation at the macro level that are present also in the micro level that are accelerating the disease process. So though you may look at that and say, well, that's not a manifestation of aging, Dr. Goodyear, the obesity, I would say, yes, it is, because it's a manifestation of accumulating dysfunction, metabolomic, microbiomic, inflammatory, and immune system. Now, you might say, well, Dr. Goodyear, there are earlier onset cancers because we have better we have better screening for these early onset cancers, and that's why we're just picking them up earlier. No, they're more aggressive. It's not that we're just picking them up early, it's that they're more aggressive. The perfect example is looking at the epigenetic pattern of early onset colorectal cancer versus what has traditionally been a later onset colorectal cancer. The methylation patterns are very different. They're very different. And in fact, the epigenetic, the patterns, interestingly enough, in early onset colorectal cancers are similar to some of the patterns that you would actually see associated with the environmental toxicants exposure, like the organophosphates, organochlorides, glyphosate, etc. Interesting. The environment we've created is the environment that's sowing the disease. So we're reaping the harvest of the disease we've created. So this is driving the more aggressive, the higher mortality rate. Again, not just seeing the aggressiveness in these early onset cancers, but we're seeing the increasing mortality rate, age adjusted, in these obesity-associated cancers. And again, 10 of these, 11 early onset, 10 of the 13 obesity-associated overlap. We have more aggressive tumor biology. We have reduced anti-tumor immune competence. This is because we have a more immune-excluded, immune desert environments, and we have coexisting metabolic disease, and these are perpetuating themselves. So we have these multitude of things working together, but then they just simply perpetuate themselves. And we are basically, I believe, we're passing these on. Not just immune dysfunction, as we talked about early onset colorectal cancer, that's the methylation pattern, but the passage of obesity is CD4 T cell dysfunction. But I think there's actually literature to support the inheritance of the microbiome dysfunction, the dysbiotic state. So the integrated disease model here, the sequential pathway to tumor initiation development, is microbiome, metabolome, chronic inflammation, inflammaging, immunosenescence, and it's a cycle that perpetuates itself. Now, what we have to do and what we have to understand is that with the dysfunction that's present, whether it's immune-excluded, immune desert, inflamed, that dictates what we do to engage the immune system. So if it's immune desert, that means there's no priming. We need to ablate part of that tumor. We need to destroy part of that tumor to actually engage some antigen presentation. And then we need some intratumoral immunotherapy to recruit activated immune cells, particularly antigen-presenting cells, to initiate that immune system function. Immune-excluded means, hey, they're already there, they recognize it, but they're just not getting in. Again, we need ablation, we need more immunotherapy to also cause infiltration. So how we would approach those would be very different. If we're just simply trying to take immune-excluded to an inflamed, then we just simply have to get more antigen presentation, more infiltration. But if we have immune desert, we're going to need to get more dead cancer cells, more ablation. We're going to need to hit the immune infiltration, engagement, activation harder to get that to a immune desert into immune excluded into an inflamed. So how we approach these different compartments will be different. And that's where I think we're going in the arena of cancer therapy, is not just saying go to war, go to destroy, but actually say, how do we turn a immune excluded, immune desert, or inflamed, though dysfunctional immune environment into one that is anti-tumor? How do we engage the immune system? And how we engage the immune system is going to be dictated differently based on those environments. Is there immunosuppression present, which you would see in both the immune excluded, immune desert? So you would target that differently to actually shift the polarization of those immune cells that are recruited in there. And this even then steps into the arena of the conversation as it relates to chemotherapy. If we want to modulate the immune system, do we do full dose chemo or do we do low dose chemotherapy? A 2020 study looking at capecitabine, low dose metronomic chemo versus full dose capecitabine. They use capecitabine, low dose metronomic chemo versus full dose. What they found is that the gut microbiome was different between the two bacteria, and the progression-free survival was different between the two, though the study was not powered to actually show that sequential connection, though there was a very, very unique association with changing the gut microbiome and changing the progression-free survival. And it was actually over a tripling in a low-dose metronomic chemo. And that's because you're preserving and modulating the immune system. So what we have here is an early immune collapse that we're propagating via inheritance. That's where this early onset cancer is coming from. These young people are inheriting an immune system that is compromised from the outset. And then the life that they live in the environment sows an environment that accelerates that aging, that inflammation, that cell senescence process, which all promotes, again, aging, and that promotes cancer. And that's why we're seeing not only early onset, more aggressive, but increasing age-associated cancers, again, a tripling from 1999 to 2020, from 3.73 to 13.52. Obesity is a biomarker. Now, it's becoming a major contributor, but it's a biomarker. It's basically, I believe, a physical manifestation, an underlying micro level of accelerating systemic inflammation and aging. And we see that manifesting in obesity because though the metabolomics isn't a separate issue, it's a driver as well. And the gut microbiome is a separate issue, it's a driver as well. The immune system, the inflammatory, separate issues, but drivers as well, but they're all intertwined. You can't connect them. Well, what they're all doing is leading to innovation of systemic failures on multiple levels, and this is leading to a higher mortality rate, more aggressive and earlier onsets of cancer. We really need your help. I tried to keep this shorter, but I just go on and on and on. We don't do Google ad buys. We don't do ad buys of any type. What we do is we seek organic growth. We don't want bots. We want this growth to be real because we want it to be about information that helps you to be able to understand the science, unbiased, not bought by anybody, but actually empowering you to live a life that is empowered via knowledge, wisdom, to give your body, your family, the best opportunity to live healthy and well, free of disease. And that word disease, dis-ease, literally means the lack of wellness. So we need you, please, to subscribe to this podcast, drop us a 5-star review. As always, the notes as well as the supporting references will be included in the show notes. So I encourage you to share those, check them out for yourself. Don't take my word for it. Read them for yourselves, and we'd love to hear your questions, so please reach out. So in addition to subscribing, please share this with those out there that would benefit from this information, because that's the way we grow. We spread this word, the science, we change the narrative, and that's to empower you, the patient, based on the science. It's bringing the focus back to the patient. It's all about serving the patient. I'm Dr. Nathan Goodyear, and this is Prescribed by Dr. Nathan Goodyear podcast. I'll see you on the next podcast.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Prescribed podcast. All references supporting this episode can be found on the prescribed.com website. That's pre-scribe.com. To get your next dose of medical innovation, make sure you subscribe to Prescribed. We'll see you for your next refill.